I'd like to start with a question for you, Michael, if I can. One of the key criticisms of free trade and deeper integration centers on the question of sovereignty. And one of the issues that Jim brought up in his opening statement about the right of private corporations to sue democratically elected governments and that sort of thing. Many people, many critics out there see this as an attack on sovereignty of our country. And worry that any greater integration would have devastating impact on our ability to democratically govern our own affairs. What do you say to those critics?
I say they're confused.
Okay.
I don't understand this preoccupation with some people on the left with Canadian sovereignty. If you think about it, there isn't a government in the world that has been more eager to join international organizations and to sign international agreements than the Government of Canada. When I was in the Department of Foreign Affairs years ago, I used to work closely with the Registrar of Treaties. And see, he once showed me all the treaties that we are party to. Took me into a room, about 10 by 15. All the walls were covered with filing cabinets in which we had copies of the various agreements that we have. I said, how many do we have, Jack? He says, about 700. We have about 700 international agreements. What they are, and any international agreement has these characteristics, these are agreements where the Government of Canada has agreed not to do certain things or to do other things in particular ways in return for other governments doing the same thing. That is, for impinging upon our sovereignty. Why do we do this? Because it's in our interest. It's in our interest that we behave in certain ways and that other governments do so at the same time. As a result of that, Canada is a better governed, better integrated, more secure, more prosperous country. With the United States alone, we have 200 of such agreements in force today. Why would any government think that entering into another international agreement to solve problems that we may have would impinge upon our sovereignty? I see that as an expression of our sovereignty.
Okay. Jim?
Well, I'm amused to hear Michael describe sovereignty as a left-wing issue. I think that's the first time I've heard that one. I'm sure there are others from other sides of the spectrum that would say I care about sovereignty as well. And signing treaties is not equivalent to giving up your sovereignty. I'm not opposed to signing treaties. I think the more treaties, the better. The question is what kind of treaties, with whom, and what are the rights that you give up as part of those treaties. And that's the issue of the free trade agreement. I'm not opposed to trade, deeper integration, even a much more efficient border. I agree with Michael about some of the pragmatic, efficient things that could be done to speed commerce at the border. And in fact, it will be much harder to accomplish those things if we lump it in together with this Big Bang theory about how we have to erase the border altogether. Forget about that discussion and zero in on a very pragmatic discussion. How can we get those trucks back and forth faster? If we were to go the route, as Michael suggested, of harmonizing regulations between the two countries in order to avoid the hassle of checking on things at the border, we are going to give up our sovereignty in some very important areas around security issues, around immigration issues, around regulatory harmonization issues, things where Canadians, in many cases, have a valid reason to do things differently than the Americans. Some of the things we do differently may not have a valid reason. There's some very specific regulations about issues like the strength of seat belts on motor cars, which it's hard to see what the Canadian shtick on it all is. But there's many other areas, think of security rights and immigration rights, where we passionately want to do things differently than the Americans. And if we go down the route of saying in order to facilitate commerce that hasn't necessarily benefited us in the way that it could have or should have, and we're going to give up these things instead, we absolutely are compromising our sovereignty.
Do you have a guiding principle in mind of where that line ought to be drawn between cooperation and at what point does cooperation become sacrificing sovereignty?
Well, cooperation is fine, and the Auto Pact example, which Michael raised earlier, is a good one. We did eliminate tariffs on trade between the two countries. We did take advantage of economies of scale as a result, whereby our factories could produce for a continental scale instead of producing a range of vehicles just for the Canadian market. And as a result, we got a lot of back and forth on the supply chain that was occurring. But that was all within the context of a certain set of conditions and commitments by the companies themselves to maintain a Canadian proportionate share and to ensure that we in Canada, instead of becoming a remote northern outpost, became central and had a key share in the overall industry that was built. The free trade agreement went in a very different direction. The free trade agreement absolved companies of making any such commitments. Companies can now import to Canada from anywhere in North America, eventually including Mexico, without making any commitments here at all. So the issue is not treaties or not, living up to your international obligations or not. The question is what kind of treaties. And the free trade model is a treaty that has given private international companies all of the power in terms of determining where they're going to invest and where they're going to produce. And that's the issue that's damaged us, not the fact that we signed a treaty.
Okay.